Hey film fans, when we talk about the films of the 1970s, we often conflate all the films of the decade with New Hollywood. So you'll hear people say, oh, I love 70s films, they're so dark and cynical, or New Hollywood was a great time because that decade was one of the best in Hollywood history, and so on. But as I said in the previous episode of this series, New Hollywood's actually a subset of 1970s film. There are reasons why we conflate the two. New Hollywood films were a surprising turn in Hollywood history. New Hollywood films do represent a type of film, a broad type, or an approach to film that has been rare through much of Hollywood history. But they're not the only films of the decade, they're not the only successful films of the decade, and they're not the only influential films of the decade. So in this episode, I'd like to take a look at the other films of the 1970s as we continue to consider the rise and fall of New Hollywood. When we talk about successful films, what does success mean? It can be a difficult descriptor to pin down. You can have films that are successful critically, but that don't get seen by a lot of people. You can have films that are massively successful at the box office, but don't have a lot of critical acclaim. You can have films that win awards, but that people will be like, I've never even heard of that. You've probably had that situation happen to you. You're watching the Academy Awards or the BAFTAs, or you're reading about Cannes Film Festival, and you're like, what is that movie? So what is success? It's hard to say. And then what is influential is also hard to say, because oftentimes we can only measure influence in very elusive ways. Like if filmmakers of today talk about, oh, of course I was influenced by The Godfather. But a film like The Godfather has developed a life of its own, and a film like The Godfather has so much of a cultural apparatus around it. What does it mean to be influenced by The Godfather? Were you influenced by the cinematography of The Godfather, the performances, that sort of cynical mix of family, politics, crime, and American history? What influenced you besides the fact that The Godfather is a great go-to early 70s film to talk about? But one way we can look at success, it's somewhat crass perhaps, but it's worth considering, is box office. So if we look at the top 20 films of the 1970s, here's a list. If you're a fan of films, you probably recognize most of the names on that list. Certainly Star Wars, Superman, Jaws, and Grease. Smokey and the Bandit.
Where are we going? No, don't tell me. Let me guess. We are a bride in search of a wedding.
No.
No?
There is a wedding in search of a bride.
At the time I was a kid, that film was huge. Animal House, again, it was huge at the time, a huge part of the sort of cultural mythology that's built up around John Belushi.
This is absolutely gross. That boy is a P.I.G. pig.
See if you can guess what I am now. I'm a zit. Get it?
But then we have Close Encounters, Kramer versus Kramer, Saturday Night Fever, The Exorcist, another horror, the Amityville Horror. There's The Godfather, Every Which Way But Loose, which was massive at the time. I don't know if it's still influential today. Another Rocky film, Apocalypse Now, The Goodbye Girl, huge Academy Award-winning film. The first Star Trek, not remembered as the best Star Trek. Heaven Can Wait, which I've done a video about. You can find it here. Alien, and The Sting, which was a huge hit, and also incidentally the first film to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards with a female producer, Julia Phillips.
You can imagine what a trip this is for a Jewish girl from Great Neck. Tonight I get to win an Academy Award and meet Elizabeth Taylor all in the same moment. Thank you so much.
The thing about this list is, if we look at them, these are all Hollywood films, big studio films, with the exception maybe of Amityville Horror, which is an American International Pictures film. How many of them would we describe as New Hollywood? Star Wars is the blockbuster that kind of ended New Hollywood. Jaws straddles the line. Close Encounters straddles the line. Maybe Saturday Night Fever. The Exorcist, yes, although we don't tend to think of New Hollywood in terms of horror, but William Friedkin is kind of one of the masters of the New Hollywood era. The Godfather, definitely. Apocalypse Now, definitely. Heaven Can Wait? Probably not. And most of those films, I'd argue, could be considered somewhat influential today. So if we look at what people were actually going to see, I've made the argument in several videos in this series that people wanted to see the New Hollywood films, and they did. And if we continued that list further, more of the typical New Hollywood films would start to pop up. But the thing to keep in mind is that when people started going back to the cinema in the early 70s, they really started going back to the cinema, and there were a lot of different types of films they wanted to see. Now, in this video, just like in the previous one where I talk about the films of New Hollywood, I can't talk about everything. I can't cover every film in 10 years or 12 or 13 years, of course. So I want to talk about a few different types of film, some of which overlapped with New Hollywood, but which on their own are kind of distinct from New Hollywood. And I'm just going to say a few words about each, and that would be the disaster film, the children's film, the musical, and independent cinema in the 1970s. So let's start off by talking about the disaster film. The disaster film was a hugely popular genre in the 1970s, particularly in the early 1970s. And some of the best representatives of that genre are still quite popular today. So you still will hear people talking about, referencing, even watching The Poseidon Adventure, The Towering Inferno, The Andromeda Strain. The 1970s disaster film era really kicked off with 1970s Airport. And this is a film that would go on to spawn several sequels. And if you want proof of how popular these sequels became, they were the impetus of the film Airplane.
Looks like I picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue.
If something gets a spoof, which then becomes its own mega hit, you know that they're a massive part of the kind of popular conversation. And Airport was hugely popular. This was a $10 million film, which was really expensive at the time, which made over $100 million. So it wasn't the kind of cash cow that The Godfather would become or that Jaws would become, but that's a wildly successful financial return on investment. Another key film of the genre is The Towering Inferno from 1974. This one cost only a little bit more to make, $12 million, but doubled Airport's box office with over $200 million. And interesting bit of trivia about this, probably some of you know, the two stars with top billing in the film were Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, and they fought behind the scenes during pre-production, both of them thinking that they were the bigger star of the time. And the producers came to an ingenious solution when they gave McQueen the first name on the poster. The second name was Newman's, but his was higher. There's a little hint at even cool guys like Paul Newman and Steve McQueen have ego issues around their place in Hollywood. These are films that tended barely to cross over with New Hollywood. Oftentimes, the disaster films, and we might even consider Jaws a disaster film, but oftentimes they did cross over in the sense that the disasters are often caused through human or corporate hubris. So there's that kind of cynicism, skepticism around corporate feasance or malfeasance in this case. But they also tend to play out in a kind of old-fashioned sort of way where there's a problem that becomes dangerous and there's a hero or a group of heroes who rise to the challenge, overcome the problem, and win. There tends to be less of the open-ended ambiguity that we find in new Hollywood films. A lot of the talent behind the camera on these films is different. So someone like George Seaton, who directed Airport, had an interesting career in sort of late classical era Hollywood, or John Guillermin, who directed The Towering Inferno, who would go on to make a few more disaster type films in the 70s and into the 80s. These were very successful kind of jobbing directors who made money on their films, but they weren't the movie brats. They weren't coming out of that small cadre of filmmakers who were trying to push the envelope. So you get a sense when you watch The Towering Inferno, The Poseidon Adventure, that these are really incredibly well-made films. But aside from, like, Airport has some wonderfully staged tracking shots, and aside from that and the cynicism I mentioned, there's not a lot that they have in common with the sort of thematic or narrative personal stories that are coming up in the new Hollywood films. With musicals, that's a little bit different. A lot of the new Hollywood filmmakers were very interested in revisiting genre, tearing apart old classical genres and kind of recrafting them in this sort of personal, darker, more torn and frayed light. So you get a film like Bob Fosse's Cabaret, which is a musical, but has a very sort of dark tone to it, has a very kind of playful, formal apparatus in the way it makes sly, direct address to the audience. And there's a sense in the film, and it was a huge success, and there's a sense there of the darkness that pervades a lot of the films of those early 70s that didn't exist just a few years earlier in something like Dr. Dolittle, or certainly not in The Sound of Music.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Fremde, étranger, stranger. Glücklich zu sehen, just les enchanté. Happy to see you, bleibe reste stay.
And there are other 70s musicals that skirt that line between musical as a kind of, I hate to say it, but it's sort of a family genre, and musical as a way to deconstruct traditional ideas of not just family, but patriotism or religion. So for example, you get these two very interesting Norman Jewison musicals in Fiddler on the Roof and Jesus Christ Superstar, which is, to me, a fascinating film. Not maybe a great film, but it's a really fascinating film in the way that it's shot on location, but with no effort to hide the fact that this is a theatrical production. In fact, the apparatus of the film's setting becomes a subtext in the film's examination of the Christ story, the crucifixion story, as one of construction. As the decade wore on, the musical started to veer back towards its more kind of playful, lighter, family-friendly, although that might be a stretch, veneer. And of course, you get one of the biggest films of the decade with Grease. At the same time, though, that darker tradition that had been started with something like Cabaret continues to live on, and another Bob Fosse film, which is All That Jazz, but also in a film like Saturday Night Fever, which almost everyone goes into that thinking, ooh, it's the Bee Gees, it's disco, it's gonna be fun, only to find out that this is really quite a dark examination of poverty or working class, of horrible kind of self-destructive toxic masculinity, although that term wouldn't have been used then, certainly not in the film. So there's some really interesting things happening in musicals in the era, and all of these musicals, not every musical of the decade, but all the ones that I've mentioned, whether light and airy like Grease or the darker ones like Cabaret and Saturday Night Fever, were really successful and were nominated for, won Academy Awards. I mean, that influence from those films can be felt in later resurgent musical eras, like in the early 2000s with films like Moulin Rouge or Chicago. For children's film or family film, the 1970s is quite an interesting era. Disney was not at its height, the sort of classical era of Snow White, Cinderella, and so on. It had started to fall on hard times financially by the time we get to the middle and late 60s, much like the rest of Hollywood had. But it put out some films in the early to mid 70s, I mean animated films here, that are some of its best remembered, at least by my generation. And that would be films like The Aristocats or The Rescuers, which I still love and my kid loves. Disney also did a great job in the 70s with its live action films. So you get, from early in the decade, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, but you also get sort of wacky films from the late 60s, like Herbie the Love Bug, which is about a sort of anthropomorphized Volkswagen Beetle, which cost $5 million and made $50 million. So for a kid's movie in 1968, that's a big haul. An interesting one for me is the 1976 film Freaky Friday, based on the Mary Higgins novel, starring Jodie Foster and Barbara Harris. Another pretty big box office success, another $5 million film, brought in $36 million. And what I find fascinating about this Freaky Friday film is that in 1976, Jodie Foster appeared in this lovely mother-daughter Disney film and Taxi Driver. And if you wanted to look at the kind of strange ways that Hollywood was producing films, distributing films, and making money off films, look at 1976, Freaky Friday and Taxi Driver. Two films that were both successful and have both been influential. We might go like, Freaky Friday. There have been like 3 reboots of Freaky Friday, all of which have made a ton of money. Every generation can think of their favorite Freaky Friday movie, right? Now, with Taxi Driver, the reboots might be more subtle, like the Joker film from a couple years ago, but that doesn't mean its influence is necessarily wider reaching. I'm not saying that Disney's Freaky Friday is a better film than Taxi Driver, but it's if we think about Hollywood distribution today versus Hollywood distribution in the 70s, one of the reasons why we should be careful about not applying the new Hollywood umbrella to the entirety of the decade is because there was such a variety in the films that Hollywood was putting out. So if you can have bums on the seat for Freaky Friday and Taxi Driver in the same year, I mean, there are lessons that the Hollywood of today can learn from that. People want different kinds of films. I mean, my parents took me to see Freaky Friday and probably also went to Taxi Driver. And so you get people who would be willing to go to both of those films. And that's one of the complaints, one of the big complaints I think about Hollywood today is that while there might still be the Freaky Fridays, although there aren't a lot of great live action children's movies these days, there aren't the Taxi Drivers, and that the studios don't trust audiences enough to go and find the original content. I'm not talking about something like The Joker with its well-established IP and its references to very specific earlier films, but something original, thought-provoking, dark and dangerous that could be a huge success at the same time that Freaky Friday, which shared a star, could also be a success. Finally, I'd just like to say a word about independent cinema in the 1970s. And independent is another word like success that can be a little bit elusive or slippery. So oftentimes we use independent or indie when we're talking about a film's spirit or the conditions under which the film was made, but still within the studio system. So you'll hear people use the word independent or independent-minded to describe new Hollywood films. But like that list that I showed you at the beginning, like most of the films that I've talked about throughout this series, most new Hollywood films were made within the studio system. They were made within a studio system that was independent-minded, that was taking risks, that was giving young or new talent the opportunity to make films like they hadn't before, and so on. But they were still dependent on studio money, studio distribution, and with that, even though there was a light touch at time, came studio demands and studio expectations. And when we get finally to the fall of New Hollywood, we'll talk about those studio expectations. But most of those films were made by white men working within the system to deliver popular films, no matter how challenging they might have been. Really very few women, Elaine May is one, and very few filmmakers of color were making studio-backed, studio-financed, or studio-distributed films. And a lot of these filmmakers had to make their films outside the system, outside of the studios, independently. And there were a lot of really fantastic, properly, truly independent films in the 1970s. So you could go back to 1970 and look at Barbara Loden's Wanda. This is a film that everybody should see if you're a fan of 70s cinema, because it does incorporate a lot of what we think of as New Hollywood films. It's made on a massively lower budget than any of them, even something like Easy Rider. And it doesn't have the same cultural cachet as those films because it was discarded. Wanda showed in New York, I think 2 screenings or 3 screenings, and that was it. People looked at it and saw its rough-hewn form, although there's a massive beauty to it, and saw its really heightened ambiguity, and saw a female protagonist who never conforms to, even for a radical era like the early 70s, she never conforms to sort of accepted notions of femininity. Or when she does, they're sort of the ones that at the time would have been considered anti-feminist or old-fashioned. And so it wasn't treated as something groundbreaking like Easy Rider. It was treated like something amateurish, something poorly realized. When you watch Wanda today, the power of that film is almost overwhelming. And what happened to Barbara Loden, I mean, luckily she is being rediscovered in the last decade or so, and her film has started to garner the kind of praise and attention that it deserves, but it was almost forgotten for 40 years, and that was partly because she was a woman. And I wonder if Wanda, the exact film, had been made by a man, if its reception would have been different. Joan Micklin Silver, who I did 3 episodes on in my What Makes This Film Great series, put out Hester Street in 1975, completely self-financed, completely self-distributed. And if you want to know more about that film, you can watch the video here, where I talk about it in some detail. Another hugely influential film that got more attention and garnered more respect than Wanda, but was still sort of brushed aside, in part because it was a woman's film. Turning to another type of film, Marvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song was released in 1971, and it's considered one of the first blaxploitation films. In fact, I talked about the rating system in an earlier video in this series. It was rated X, and Marvin Van Peebles use that in a very interesting way in his marketing campaign. But this kicked off an era of blaxploitation films, and that's a whole area that we don't have time to get into in this, about the way blaxploitation films used kind of racist tropes against white audiences, but also in an insider way that would have excited black audiences. And they featured a lot of sort of male macho bravado, sexuality, sexualization, violence, and things like this. But they were films also that, at least early in the blaxploitation cycle, were not getting made inside the studio system, so needed to be self-financed, self-distributed, like Sweet Sweetback. Around that same time, there was a whole group of filmmakers who were studying at UCLA, and these were African-American filmmakers making highly political, non-Hollywood style films. And that tight affiliation. It wasn't actually a school, but that kind of tight affiliation of filmmakers who are working with each other, encouraging each other, collaborating with each other, became known as the LA Rebellion. And that was a kind of film movement that purposefully positioned itself as anti-Hollywood. So the LA Rebellion films were constructed not only to feature black stories, black lives, black political issues, but they were structured in such a way that they eschewed traditional Hollywood narrative strategies, elements of continuity editing, linear storytelling. And they did so as a political statement to kind of push what filmmaking can be. Remember, oftentimes we think that films are good when they have a beginning and a middle and an end, but you can take a camera or a phone and point it at things and edit it however you want and project it on a screen, and it's a film. Film has so many possibilities, and in a lot of ways, as much as I love Hollywood, Hollywood limits us to looking at film in a very narrow way, and film's potential in a very narrow way. And for the filmmakers of the LA Rebellion, like Charles Burnett and Bill Caldwell, Ali Sharon Larkin or Barbara McCulloch, the opportunity to make films that weren't just black films, but that were intentionally non-Hollywood films was part of the creative process of making those films. And a lot of those films are now available in an archival repository online. I'll put the link in the description below. Out of that movement also came Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust in 1991. And Julie Dash was an LA Rebellion filmmaker, and she worked in that milieu of boundary pushing, not specifically Hollywood type cinema. And it took her, up to 1991 to make Daughters of the Dust, which is the first, the first Hollywood studio film to be directed by an African-American woman. I'll say that again. 1991 saw the first Hollywood studio film directed by an African-American woman. And if you haven't seen Daughters of the Dust, you need to correct that. It's not a 70s film. But it's in some ways the fruition of a lot of work that went on in the 70s as these filmmakers of the LA Rebellion continually pushed, prodded, and also refined their filmmaking strategies. Finally, one can't really mention independent cinema in the 1970s without talking about John Cassavetes. John Cassavetes made 5 films in the 70s: Husbands, Minnie and Moskowitz, A Woman Under the Influence, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and Opening Night. And if you consider yourself a fan of 1970s American cinema and you don't know John Cassavetes, you need to go out and watch those films, A Woman Under the Influence or The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, just like you need to watch all of these independent films. Cassavetes is a vital figure in American cinema history. He started in the 50s as one of the first kind of modern independent filmmakers with his film Shadows. And then he made a couple studio films in the 60s, and he was dreadfully unsatisfied with the process. He was also a high-profile Hollywood actor, and he starred in films like The Dirty Dozen and Rosemary's Baby. And what he figured out by around 1968 when he made his film Faces is that he could go and act in Hollywood films and make a pretty good paycheck doing that, and then take that money and self-finance and self-distribute his own films. And that's what he did for most of the rest of his career. He did have a sort of 80s dalliance with Hollywood again. Now, he included some Hollywood actors in his films, although he had a stable of actors he drew on, specifically his wife Gina Rowlands, Ben Gazzara, who a lot of you probably know is Jackie Treehorn, and Peter Falk, who's probably the most famous of the Cassavetes actors, mainly for playing Columbo and the grandfather in A Princess Bride. Cassavetes films are very different from Hollywood films. There's little exposition. There's little effort to orient the viewer in the world. It's kind of like we enter a world where things are already happening, and we just have to watch and we have to put it together ourselves, and sometimes we can't. And where I talked in the previous video about a new Hollywood realism, and realism grounded in like production design and location shooting, filmmakers like Cassavetes take that a step further, because for Cassavetes, the realism comes from, like, if you enter into a situation, no one's gonna stop and give you the backstory. No one's going to refer to everyone in the room by their first name for the first 10 minutes. So you can go like, oh yeah, that's Jim. Oh yeah, that's Sheila. Oh yeah, that's Tommy. They're just going to live their lives happening as they've happened. And that's one of the thrills of watching Cassavetes films. And in some ways, Cassavetes films are sort of uber new Hollywood films because they are outside the studio system. They're able to take that kind of non-traditional narrative approach and actually take it a few steps further because they're less worried about pleasing a broader audience. And one last thing I'll say, I mentioned Elaine May earlier, and this is not an independent film per se, but Elaine May's third film as a director, Mikey and Nicky, is one that stars John Cassavetes and Peter Falk. And to see these two guys acting together, and it's virtually only them with some interesting side parts for actors like Ned Beatty and a few others, but it's virtually Cassavetes and Peter Falk, two friends in real life, acting the hell out of this dark, twisted, sort of pseudo-gangster film. And I highly recommend that, and I'll definitely be doing a What Makes This Film Great episode on Mikey and Nicky at some point in the future. But thanks everybody. Like I said, obviously I can't touch on all the films of the 70s that weren't New Hollywood films, and we could talk about sports films like Rocky or North Dallas 40, and we could talk about 70s revisionist westerns, some of which have some New Hollywood stuff going on in them, especially maybe some of Clint Eastwood's films like The Outlaw Josie Wales. But I just wanted to remind you that when we're thinking about the 70s and when we're thinking about New Hollywood, they're not necessarily the same. And it's worth remembering that as filmgoers started going back to the cinema, there was a lot on offer. The studios trusted audiences, adults, young adults, college students, black audiences, white audiences, children, to seek out a wide variety of films. And one of the great things about the 70s is that it wasn't all New Hollywood, that you could go see Rocky and Jaws and Star Wars at the same time that you went to see Days of Heaven, Nashville, The Last Movie, or Shampoo. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. I'd love if you'd hit the like button, and if you want to, hit the subscribe button. What are your favorite films from the 70s? What are your favorite non-New Hollywood films from the 70s? Are there some, if you're old enough like me to remember the era, that you remember loving? What was the first film you saw when you went to the cinema in the 70s? Or are there some, if you're a little bit younger, that you've discovered that are fantastic films of the era, but that don't slot quite under that New Hollywood umbrella? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Until next time though, my name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.